Consequences of incapacity. Let's just race here. We're just running quite late, and we do have two topics today, and the other one is privity. So privity, again, the thing is, pretty much what I'm going through here is what's in the desk lectures. We're not really adding to it, which always makes me stress a little bit. So if you're listening on the recording now, go and listen to the desk lectures. They're much more organised than me trying to talk to people in class. And come back to these if you think you'll get something extra out of them. So really, at the end of the day, the reason we do this section, well, other than that it sits as part of the fundamentals of what contracts are and understanding that, is we need to understand what the different consequences of incapacity are. So we keep coming back to this idea of severance. Again, I'm going to go really lightning fast here. It is worth remembering those rules about severance. Can we pull out this section, and if we can, will the contract make sense? So if the whole contract is oppressive in some way, then the contract as a whole will be cut down. But if it's not, then we might be able to sever out the offending parts. So if we have a contract that deals with a number of different parts of subject matter, some of which are necessaries, some of which relate to a beneficial contract of service, and some of which are just different again, we might be able to sever out the different again bits and have the rest of the contract stand. Take a look at your textbook on severance. Severance is not something that courts do lightly. And one of the things that from next week onwards, we're going to be talking about the contents of a contract in a lot of detail. And one of the things I'm going to say to you all now is that you would be really well served to make sure that you've looked at the desk lectures on the contents of the contract, particularly topic 10, before you, on contents of a contract, in particular the express terms topic, which is 9 or 10, can't remember now. Listen to them both for safekeeping before you finalise your assignments. Okay? We're no longer in Mr. Nice Guy territory where I am promising you that things in the contract problem are things that we've discussed in class. We just don't have the time for that anymore. So you do need to start to think about now the whole of a contract in a much broader sense. And most of the things that you will cover off in the topic that deals with what the express terms of a contract are, we have started to touch on over the weeks. So we're at week 8 now, I think, technically, or in the 8th week of doing this course, 7th or 8th, must be at least 8. We've been talking about what it is that the contents of a contract are by looking at what it takes to make the contract. We know that the offer needs to contain the DNA of the deal. You need to be able to be clear on who the parties are, what the key terms are, what the essential terms are, where the consideration moves, how does it move from one party to another, just from the process of identifying what the agreement is. So it will feel like it's a different topic, but it's all bringing together the jigsaw puzzle that we've been dealing with. So again, part of reading into these topics that we're in now and moving into is looking at what the role of the court is in making a contract whole if for some reason there is an issue. Now that could be because there are essential terms or key terms that appear to be missing. We've already discussed that. The courts will not add in terms that the parties didn't contemplate. They are loath to add additional terms, but at the same time, a court would rather find something that looks like a contract to be enforceable than not. So if it can find a sensible way to read it, it will do so. Similarly, in the kind of context that we have now, the courts just don't lightly say that kids can get off paying for stuff. So they will be looking for ways to make sense of the contract and to see how the contract fits together. At the same time, they also don't lightly allow vendors to sell things or to induce children into entering into contracts that may not be beneficial to them or that have onerous terms. So again, we can see how that fits. So severing must not alter entirely the scope and intention of the agreement. If taking a clause or taking an element of the contract out results in the document or the contract being an entirely different thing, that is a problem. So the remaining contract needs to be able to stand on its own. So we've got a couple of different types of voidable contracts that we're dealing with here. We've got the first type, contracts that are binding unless they're repudiated. So what does repudiation mean? Rejection? Yeah. Rejection is a really good word for it. So some kind of action or activity where the person having the right to repudiate does something to say that the contract, they're not going to be bound by the contract anymore. So again, the contract still needs to be in play for this to actually make sense. Okay? So acquisitions of something that has a continuing or a permanent nature, for example, land, entering into a lease, buying company shares, becoming a partner, setting up a business with somebody, those things could be repudiated during the minority or within a reasonable time after turning 18. So if I, can you see, I'm clearly only 17. If I agree to sell you shares in my startup company, but I haven't actually, they haven't been transferred yet. I'm not going to talk about the clawback provisions yet. I might have agreed to sell them. I could come back the next day and say, no, I'm not going to do that. You can't hold me to that contract. You know, I talked to my dad. It's not a good deal. I'm not going to do it. I've repudiated before I've turned 18. Say I turn 18, I still haven't sold them yet. You still can't sue me at that point if it's within a reasonable time. Of course, if I made that promise to you when I was actually 17, and that is now some years ago, chances are you could hold me to that promise now, because, you know, let's say 30-something years have passed. I clearly didn't repudiate within a reasonable time. So this is permanent and continuous subject matter. Questions, concerns? That's really all I want to say about that. So, actually, there was one thing. That's why I put it in red, so I don't forget. These are voidable by the minor. It's not voidable by the person to whom the promise has been made. Minors will not be responsible for future obligations at the point that they repudiate. Doesn't mean that they can undo what's gone before. So in relation to things that have happened in the past, the way that the law seems to fit is it will look at whether or not, it will inquire ultimately into fairness to an extent. So on repudiating a contract, a minor will be entitled to recover land that they've transferred. However, if they've transferred goods, then they could only be recovered if they haven't received all of the promised consideration. So if the contract is done and dusted, it's too late. Contract's still in play, we can repudiate. The legislation itself can impact the position in each state. And in particular in relation to Victoria, we have a more general rule in relation to ratification in particular. Speaking of which, contracts that require ratification. So these are the contracts that will only be binding if they're ratified. So the contracts that continue on, they exist until they're repudiated. Here we've got contracts that only become binding when they're ratified. At common law, this is all contracts that are not for necessaries or not involving continuing interests or necessaries, beneficial interests, beneficial contracts of employment or continuing interests. Will not be binding unless they're ratified. In Victoria, that just means they will not be binding, because the Supreme Court Act in Victoria prevents proceedings on the ratification of a contract that's made by a minor. So they're just simply, unless they fall into the categories of necessaries, the slide doesn't say it, beneficial contracts of employment, they're bundled in together in that idea, or continuous subject matter, then basically in Victoria you cannot ratify later. Well, if you do ratify later, the court will not allow proceedings brought on that ratification. So if you ratify and then breach, it's as if you had never ratified. So, questions, concerns, frustrations?
So in Victoria, ratification just like isn't a thing?
Effectively, because of statute. So if the statute changed, common law would bring it back in again, right? Okay? But there's a statute. The statute says, Section 50 of the Supreme Court Act says you can't sue in relation to this. Doesn't mean that people can't do it, right? I agree. I'm a 15-year-old. I agree to, I don't know, something that's not a necessary. I agree to let you be my sports agent for my incredible running career. And it's not a necessary. I don't need it. I'm no Wayne Rooney of running. It's not, you're not giving me any education or anything like that, but we go along and we've got the contract and you do your bit and I pay you 10% of the money that you earn for me along the way, and then I turn 18 and I ratify it. I say, okay, let's formally ratify this forever, because I've forgotten to read the next page of the textbook and don't realise that it matters. And so we continue on for there, and you keep paying, finding great deals for me, and I keep paying you 10% going forward. It's fine. It's no problem at all. Then maybe along the line, I work out, oh, actually, I needed to ratify that. That's a problem. Maybe I can get out of it. At that point, you say, oh no, we'll just start with a brand new contract. Thank you very much. You've already paid me. I've already paid you. You've done the things that you needed to do. I can't really claw that back either. Okay, unless there was some kind of unfairness or something else that was there. Does that make sense? It is worth thinking about what happens though, because kids enter into contracts every day, don't they? Think about buying a cup of coffee at a cafe, or going and, I used to go to the milk bar all the time for my dad and pick up cigarettes and bottles of booze. It probably was the pub that I went to. So like every kind of law was being broken along the way, and you know, there'd be plenty of times. I can remember going into, I probably shouldn't tell these stories, but going into the pub that wasn't very far from my house and getting cigarettes and booze and promising to come back later with the money. And they'd give it to me, and I was fine. I'd come back later with the money. But, okay, so this stuff happens all the time. Hopefully that doesn't happen so much anymore, and it probably explains why I'm so warped now.
What about kids I don't know, might be completely off topic, but you know the kids that sit out on the footpaths and they have their little stalls and they sell...
Buy and sell things. Yeah, that's a really good example. The lemonade store, okay? So that's a problem. So let's think about the lemonade store. Let's think about Egg Boy buying his robot. We started there, let's come back to there. Actually, let me stop for a second, because we'll think about... So Egg Boy, what do we think would be the issues with Egg Boy? Did Egg Boy have capacity to contract if he was 17? No, clearly not. He's a minor. Let's assume that there wasn't a mix-up, that the facts are slightly different. He turns up to buy the robot. I think one of the options was he was going to pay in 4 instalments. Let's say that the facts worked out he's going to pay in 4 instalments. He pays the first instalment and he goes away. Never pays anything more. What were they called? Final Solutions Cleaning, or Final Cleaning Solutions. Could they sue Egg Boy for the benefit, for the balance? No. Why not?
Because it's not a necessary.
That's the question it'd come down to. I would probably argue it isn't necessary. He has a business of supplying, like performance art. Presumably, he needs to clean up after it. Presumably, this is a necessary for him in his state. I think you could run an argument. Maybe not. Maybe not. I can see how it could run. It's a lot of money to spend on a robot. You'd need a lot more information. But you could probably, he has a business. He's doing this thing. It's a fairly unusual thing. But yeah, you've gone to exactly the right question. Is it a necessary? Is it a beneficial contract of service? Clearly not a beneficial contract of service. You know, he's buying a product. So does he need the product? His station of life, his job? I think you can run an argument. I think there would be an argument in it either way. You would certainly need much more information. Is it ongoing, continuous subject matter? Probably not. Okay, it's just he's got the thing, he's going to use it, he's just got an obligation to pay the balance.
Okay.
Tina?
I think it depends on the egg white boy. Got the robot for the company or for himself. If under company's name you consider the egg boy.
Well, you're right. I mean, Egg Boy wasn't trading as anything other than himself in that particular. So he was buying it himself. He was a sole trader. Okay. So remember, again, it's a very good distinction, but we need to be really quite technical here. So yes, he's doing it for a business that he owns, but in fact, it's not an incorporated business. It's just him operating the business every day. If he was the sole shareholder in Egg Boy Incorporated or Egg Boy Proprietary Limited, and the company made that promise, the situation would be different because the company has capacity to contract. We don't even have a capacity problem then, right? If he had pledged his shares as security for the balance of the payment, which would be ridiculous, but let's say he had, that would be continuous and permanent subject matter. So again, it might be dealt with differently. Probably would be quite different because it'd be more akin to a loan than just a straight out, there's a contract, something has been provided.
When there's, considering that Egg Boy example, and there's fair and reasonable price, 45K for that cleaning device, and there's other options, is it?
It's 45K. I think for reasons that might become obvious to you over time, the price was specifically above the limit that might be a consumer transaction under the Australian Australian consumer law. The reason, just in case you were wondering, if the madness of a particular price for a robot, but I always have somebody who really thinks they're being very clever and goes down the consumer law path in that first assignment. Nobody did it this time. This is a really good group. Like, there's no tricking you, or other that somebody's worked out the notes and is sharing it some way. But yeah, so I know that the price would have been higher than
options, like, would a court consider, why did you need a cleaning robot? Why couldn't you get a hose to clean your eggs? That's more. Exactly.
But that's the kind of discussion that would be in the whole question of, is it a necessary for the time? And I don't know what kind of performance art he does. It's ridiculous. Sorry. You can ask anything.
Off topic, but doesn't that sort of make the whole notion of capacity it's so subjective, I guess, because you could have two 17-year-olds buying the same product. One of them has a business, so it's seen as a necessary, and the other one doesn't. But in terms of capacity, shouldn't they be at the same level? Absolutely.
I can see exactly where you're coming from. And why do you think we do it? So, I mean, I think probably a better example there is the school uniform example. Two kids go in, buy the same school uniform. One of them goes to that school and needs a school uniform to go to school. The other one just likes to wear private school uniforms, as you do. Well, he was travelling to Japan, wanted to go all anime or something. I don't know. But they've chosen this. Yeah. They're different things. But think about the rationale behind it. What purpose does this law serve? Think about it. It puts the onus on the shopkeeper or the vendor to think about, well, actually, if I'm going to give something to someone on credit, because the reality is that the transaction's done, provided that the price is a reasonable price, it's done. But it puts the onus on the vendor because they're the ones who are going to lose. So this is why I do need to inquire into it. I think about phone contracts in particular. Now that's got a continuous and permanent subject matter sort of, but it's the other way. You're buying something, but you're committing often to a 2-year payment plan to buy something. Is it a necessary? Will depend on your station in life. Might depend on whether you already have a phone or not. So I don't know. I haven't actually had to do it for a while. I know when my kids were, younger, I had to, on a telephone contract, I had to sign, like it had to be in my name. But it's not something I've inquired into. But again, there are things that younger people enter into all the time. And then if we think about it from the point of view of, well, you're a drunk. You happen to be drunk and you go and sign up for a telephone contract or buy a robot or whatever it happens to be. Again, if you pay full price in one go, doesn't matter. But again, the onus is then put on the person who is selling to a person who's clearly inebriated to say, yeah, no, I'm not going to give you something on credit. We're going to sell this all in one go. Fabian, you were trying to make a point.
The onus is on the seller.
Beautiful. I keep interrupting you with points. Sorry. I'll give you the clicker next time.
You get checked for ID or like whatever.
Exactly. Well, the thing is too, in the real world, life isn't as simple as we make it in this classroom because there are a whole heap of different laws. So you go to buy booze, sure, there's the contract element of it, but that's kind of the last thing on the publican's mind these days. It's like actually their licensing laws mean that they're committing an offence if they sell to somebody who is underage or who's inebriated. But the licensing laws actually reflect to an extent something that's sitting in contract. But so those of you with RSAs will have thought this through in your own way. Non-necessaries that are obtained by fraud can be recovered provided that the property is still identifiable and the minor still has it. So if a minor goes and enters into a contract with, oh look, who is it, Nia? Are these yours? All these colours? Okay, Will. Just say a minor. He pushes them away because just say a minor decided fraudulently to enter into a contract with Will's stationery company to buy every piece of stationery that he happens to own, and Will said, "Look, yeah, I'll give you terms on this provided you've got capacity to contract." Are you over the age of 18? Yes, I am. Pulls out the fake ID even, the fake stationery ID, because everybody needs a fake ID for buying stationery. And you've committed a fraud. So Will could then come back when he's not paid and take those goods back. Take that alcohol back. Take whatever it was that this child has purchased under fraud. But if this is a particularly studious child who then takes all of these highlighters and goes and highlights every single textbook that they own to the point where the ink in the highlighters is no longer recoverable, we can't necessarily identify it. It's not in the child's possession anymore. That example went a little bit lopsided along the way, but I think you understand. So again, I'm a child, I defraud you into selling me a pallet of apples. The apples are now in my stomach. Too bad, so sad. Or I'm a child, I have defrauded you into selling me a skateboard that I don't need. I've then on-sold it, quite possibly to another child. It's not in my possession. Too bad, so sad. Again, the onus is on the shopkeeper. So contracts that are not binding on the minors will be binding unless repudiated. What have I got here? Contracts that are not binding on minors or binding unless repudiated are only binding once they're ratified. So no action can be taken to enforce the contract against a minor unless and until the contract is ratified by the minor. Again, I'm not going to spend any time here because Section 50 of the Supreme Court Act basically says in Victoria that doesn't matter and you're examined on the law of Victoria. And I can tell you with some certainty that We don't spend a lot of time on minors or on this in most of the exams anyway. You just need to understand. What's involved in ratification? In Victoria it doesn't matter at all, but at common law we just need some clear indication. So a letter, an email, even a looking you in the eye and saying I ratify that contract will be enough, but again in Victoria it's ineffective, so we don't really care too much. If you are in a place where it does matter and you fail to ratify, then the contracts with minors are not binding on the minor or the previous minor unless and until that ratification happens. Pretty straightforward. What about void contracts? The following contracts with minors are rendered void anyway, regardless. This is Section 49 of the Supreme Court Act. Contracts for repayment, paying a loan. So all those times when your mother loaned you money when you were young and guilted you into repaying it, the guilt was necessary because she was never going to be able to sue you. Contracts for the payment of goods that are not necessaries. So basically the Supreme Court Act is mirroring the common law. Accounts stated. So that's, in other words, a minor who's saying, yeah, I agree, I owe you $50. Doesn't matter. Section 51 renders void promises by a person once they achieve majority to repay a loan. So that just mirrors Section 50 and closes that loop. Property in goods passes to the minor under a void contract, but the other party might have a claim in tort, conversion or detenue or restitution. So once the goods are passed over, the property in the goods transfers, even though the contract is void. So the avenue for redress is not contract law. Okay, you need to find another way. Tort is most likely. Conversion, detenue, potentially restitution. That's actually all I really want to say about this, because otherwise the slides will give you the notes in relation to where the sections come from, and also there is a desk lecture about other elements. While I finish up and change slide packs, any other questions, concerns, frustrations? Because we've got I'll only have 10 effective minutes on the next topic, so. Ace, give me a second. I'll just change slide packs.